Welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic cult and current films and the people that made them, and many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer is Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lehrhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight, our honored guest is author, television writer, producer, director, and accomplished documentarian Nick Davis, whose book, Competing with Idiots, is a terrific study of legendary Citizen Kane screenwriter Herman Mankiewicz and his brother, equally legendary writer-director Joseph Mankiewicz, he of All About Eve, Guys and Dolls, and Cleopatra fame, amongst others. Not surprisingly, this is a very inside look at these twin legends, helped by the fact that Nick is Herman Mankiewicz's grandson and Joe's great nephew. What a film history feast this book is, a real treasure to read. Welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, Nick.
Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here.
Just for those of you listening and watching on your YouTube and True TV feeds, this is just a fun book to read. I mean, there's a million film histories out there, a lot of them written very well from a distance. Nick's book is very much an insider's look at these people who are obviously his relatives. And the emotion, the sense of inside, getting inside their heads and their lifestyles are just really intimate and just fascinating to read. And plus the fact you're a damn good writer.
Oh, well, thank you, Steve. I don't want to say it was a pleasure to write this book, but it is a pleasure to have written this book.
Well, you're going to tell us about this long journey into into the worlds of the Mankiewiczes. But let's start with you first. When you were a little boy, I ask this of a lot of our guests. It's kind of my thing. I always like to find out, did you go to the movies much, and what was your theater of choice? Where did you start seeing movies?
Oh, wow. What a great question. I would say yes. The answer is yes. We did go to the movies. I did go to the movies. And I don't know that I really had a theater of choice until I was about 9. I remember I grew up in New York City. I remember a lot of different theaters. We grew up in the Village, Greenwich Village, and there was one on 6th Avenue and 3rd Street that we went to, but there was no particular theater until I was 9 and we moved uptown. We moved to the Upper West Side. And then I would say there were 2 main theaters, Lowe's 84th Street Quad at that point, which had 4 theaters. I don't know how many are there now. And the Lowe's Tower East on 72nd and 3rd. That one was where I saw a lot of movies. For some reason, I lived on the West Side, but I went over to 72nd and 3rd and saw a lot of movies there.
Now, is there a movie that stands out for you, like one of the first movies that impressed you? I know a lot of youngsters go to Disney movies with their family. It's kind of a rite of passage.
Young Frankenstein.
Ah,
Young Frankenstein was the first really important movie in my life in 1974. We lived in California for a year, and that was the year Young Frankenstein came out. So we saw it out there and then moved to New York. And I remember kept seeing it. And so I think I saw it in the theater 9 times on its initial release. Yeah, that was the movie for me.
that's great. That's great. I did not have that experience. My earliest experiences were watching science fiction and horror double features at the Fox West Coast Village in Pico
Okay.
Robertson area.
Oh,
And,
great.
yes, The Blob, The Day the Earth Stood Still, Forbidden Planet, and War of the Worlds stand out definitely. Um, so in school, I mean, obviously you have a very strong entertainment background, not only coming from great pedigree, but you obviously developed a great interest in many aspects of show business. Did this begin in school?
I guess so. I acted in plays in school and certainly in high school, and then continued on in college. I did a lot of improv in college, and that was sort of my first love. I directed a play in college and thought, well, this was really fun, and made sure that play, which was, I mean, I shudder to think what it actually looked like. But I remember really enjoying getting to fix the acting in that play, and then yeah, so it was always, as I talk about in the book. I mean, I think there was so much un account. Well, what's the word? There was so much pressure that I had no idea there it existed. So I was invisible, or the pressure was invisible to me. It was just baked in that this was obviously the only thing I could possibly do. And because Herman and then my mother had died young, I think I sort of had the assumption that I would die young, and therefore I didn't really need to figure it out because I would just do whatever came up until an untimely death. So it took me a long time to sort of think, well, wait a minute. All right, but I actually need to make some decisions here. So yeah, I'm sort of jumping into I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but yeah.
Sure, sure. Well, you decided to do this amazing book a long time ago. It's a long gestation period. What was the inciting moment that said you got to write this book?
Well, so as you mentioned, I'm a documentary filmmaker by trade, and that is sort of how I earn my living. And my wife, Jane Mendelsohn, my who beloved wife and now partner in our production company, she and I watched All About Eve together, and she said, this movie is really just an autobiography of Joe, because you've got the older artist, Margot Channing, Betty Davis, who is larger than life and totally charismatic and wonderful. And then Eve Harrington, scheming, cold, ambitious, trying to take her down. That's Joe and Herman, right? And first I thought, I'm so glad I married this brilliant woman. And then I thought, yeah, that's like a film. That's a documentary. So I called up Susan Lacey, who used to run the American Masters program at PBS. And I said, let's meet. I have an idea, and I pitched her on a documentary about the two brothers. And she said, yeah, this is a good idea. Let's do this. And she gave me a teeny bit of money to start development on a documentary about these two brothers, basically on their relationship, Herman and Joe. And that, make a long story short, I had backed into my own production company because I had worked on a documentary for someone else, and they had taken my script and turned it into a book. And I thought, but I wrote this script. I should have a piece of this. So I formed my own production company, and this was a couple of years before this had happened. And so I was always thinking, ooh, companion book, companion book, companion book. So in December of 2002, I was at a Christmas party here in New York City, and I said to a friend of mine who was a book agent who asked me what I was doing, I told him about the Mankiewicz thing, and he said, well, that's a book. And I said, well, that's what I was thinking. So we sold it. I put a pitch together and sold it as a companion book to this documentary. Well, the documentary never happened because American Masters, for all kinds of reasons, they were interested in more Scorsese, Bob Dylan level fame than Herman and Joe Mankiewicz level fame. And clips were going to be prohibitively expensive, so they couldn't get the money together. But then I was left with this book contract around my neck, and I thought, and now I really have to write this book. So it took a really long time from that moment on, because I thought, well, I'll be researching and it'll happen all together. And so, I'm still having to put food on the table and make other films and TV and whatever. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, I have to get going on this book. And there were several processes, which I'm happy to go into in terms of how I finally had the breakthrough, or what I considered to be the breakthrough, that allowed me to start writing. Which I can tell you.
Oh,
Which
feel free. The only
okay.
thing I was going to ask you about is obviously Herman died long before you were born. Joe, well, you were around when Joe was alive, but you were a little boy for the most part.
Yeah, and I'd only met Joe a handful of times in my life, and then he died when I was 25 or 27 or something.
Oh,
And
you were that old. Okay, got it. But it was
yeah,
before you started the book.
Oh yeah, well before I started the book, but I never knew him. And as I say in the book, the one time I met him as an adult, went to the French consulate where he was being given an award, and my dad said, "Do you want to come along?" And I went along, and I thought, this guy's great. He's just like my Uncle Frank, who we see all the time, and he's Mankiewicz. He's flesh and blood. I don't understand why do we not see this guy when I was growing up? And he lived an hour from the city. I mean, it made no sense. So I can tell that story too if you want, but basically, what I was told at that point was a story that sort of made me think, oh, all right, well then Joe was a jerk, and I have nothing, I don't need to think about him. So then years later, when I actually started, researching it for the aborted American Masters documentary, I realized, well, Joe is a very, very complicated and brilliant man, as was Herman. This is great, these two guys. This is going to be a great film. Okay, it's not going to be a great film. It's going to be a book. I don't know who's going to write this book. How am I going to write this book? So luckily, I had a fantastic editor and very patient editor who, when I first met her, the day we met, she said, look, the contract is going to say 18 months, but don't worry about it. Her name is Vicki Wilson, and maybe you know her. She wrote a brilliant biography of Barbara Stanwyck. And at that point, she said to me, look, I've been working on my Barbara Stanwyck biography for 10 years. Until I handed my Barbara Stanwyck biography, don't even worry about it. So literally, I think 10 years go by, and then she calls me up one day and she says, so I handed in my book. Where are you? And I said, yeah, right. I got to get going. And I'd been researching and really trying to write it, but I had about 150 pages that was just Wikipedia level, dry, boring. It was so boring and uninteresting to me, who was writing it about my relatives. And then again, a conversation with Jane opened my eyes, and I realized, oh, wait a minute, this is not a book just about these two guys. This is a book about three guys. It's a book about Herman, it's a book about Joe, and it's a book about Nick. So Nick is going to weave his biography in and out of Joe and Herman and look at these comparisons. Here's where Herman gets fired. Here's where Nick gets fired. Here's where Joe lives in New York City. Here's where Nick lives in New York City. So I did it, and I got through to the end. I wrote it in 6 months, and I was just like, all right, here's the book. And I gave it to my editor, and she said, okay, good. This is what you needed to do to get writing. Now take yourself out of it. And after about a year of kicking and screaming and trying to sort of noodle around the edges, one afternoon I thought, well, all right, let me just take these chunks out. And I took the chunks out, printed it out, and read, a 200-page, not full book, but I thought, aha, she's right. It now has a voice. The book has a voice. The book is coming from someplace. And it's not boring. I'm trying to be objective about these guys. This is the book from the grandson or great nephew's point of view about these two legends in my mind and what I make of them. It's a portrait. It's a dual portrait. It's not a dual biography. It's a dual portrait. If someone else objects, wants to write their own book, feel free. This is my version of these two guys. And so, from that point on, it was still a lot of work, beefing up the sections of their lives that I hadn't included, and smoothing it all out. But I at least had the book. So that whole process from start to finish and until it was published was 19 years.
Well, it is
And it's taken me almost 19 years to tell you this story.
well, it's definitely not a Wikipedia style biography by any means. You have a tremendous ability to tell this story with layers of interest. I did not find it to be dry at all. I didn't know much about either of them, although obviously, as you and I have talked about, I'm very involved in developing a movie about Mankiewicz versus DeMille. So I've been very much aware of that aspect of it, but I didn't really know anything about his family life, and I knew very little about Herman. Now, let me ask a question. Obviously, both were not available for you to do interviews with. Was there electronic material on either of them that you could tap into?
Yes, and this was the greatest gift is in the 70s. A man named Richard Merriman wrote a biography called Mank about Herman, and a man named Ken Geist wrote a biography called People Will Talk or Pictures Will Talk about Joe. And both of these gentlemen, Dick Merriman had been a family friend, but Geist had not been, but both of them just gave me all their interviews and transcripts and tapes. And so I had mounds of material from the 70s, including a lot of interviews with Joe. Still no Herman, but a lot of people who had known Herman had talked to Dick Merriman for his book. So that was a way to get a lot closer to these guys. And then, I did do original interviews with all the surviving cousins and Alex and, the other Mankewitzes. So that was very helpful. And then at a certain point, it was just, okay, I can't be a completist. I have to, I think I know my Herman, I know my Joe, and I'm gonna write it.
For the people watching on either YouTube or um, True TV Plus, I've put up a family portrait which shows their father, Herman, and Joe's father, Franz. And I found it very interesting. We all are very much affected by our fathers. Sometimes they're not there, and our mothers raise us. Sometimes it's the opposite, and just sometimes they're a bit of a pill as a father. Franz definitely was a bit on the pill side in terms of encouraging his, or I should say, discouraging his sons to get into show business. Tell us a little bit of what you feel about Franz's effect on their lives, because it sounds like Herman particularly was very much damaged by the way he was raised.
Yeah, Franz was, he was a creature of his time. He was a German immigrant and a Prussian immigrant, and had and cared devoutly about education and intellectual pursuits. And so, he was a teacher and then a professor. Um, and so really entertainment and movies made no sense to him. It wasn't what a serious person should be doing. And when he was growing up, I mean, when they were growing up, even more than that, it was, what are you doing bringing home a 97? What happened to the other 3 points? Said without irony. I mean, it was really, he was a total perfectionist and insisted on the best from Herman. And Joe, to a lesser extent, because he was so much younger. And by the time Joe came along, Franz, I think, was had eased up a little bit and was concentrating more on other things, and on Herman still, who continued to be a disappointment to Franz. Certainly in Herman's eyes, Herman felt he was a tremendous disappointment to his dad. I'm never going to be able to live up to this, so the hell with it. I'm not even going to try. Was kind of his attitude. And Herman was a man of prodigious gifts and talents, and was, said to be the greatest talker anyone had ever heard, was so funny. But, Ben Heck said nobody with a genius like Herman's could ever actually put it down on paper. Herman never wanted to repeat a joke. So, the idea of crafting something and really honing it and making it good or better than good, that was sort of not really what Herman liked to do. He liked to live large and say funny things and hope somebody was writing them down, which in a way made him perfect for the early Hollywood. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead, but the point is, Franz, Franz loomed so large in Herman's life, and to some extent in Joe's, but really Herman loomed large in Joe's life. So, Herman was always trying to live up to Franz, and Joe was always trying to live up to Herman.
Your portrait of Herman, particularly when he comes out to Hollywood, is of a very damaged person, someone who just is not comfortable. I guess I think the easy way is that he did not suffer fools gladly. Of course, the title of your book is Competing with Idiots. I think he probably thought most of the people in Hollywood were idiots. But he obviously he's very well known. His signature project was Citizen Kane. And for those of the for those of the viewers and listeners who don't know where the project came from, this was an original screenplay idea. It wasn't based on a book of any kind, was it?
No, it wasn't based on anything other than conversations that Herman had after he had had a car accident and was laid up in bed with Orson Welles. Played, I see you've got a picture of Gary Oldman behind you. Who Gary Oldman played Herman in the movie Mank.
By the way, what did you think of Mank as a movie? Did you? You probably have a very strong opinion of it.
Well, no, I do and I don't. I'm a read in the wind on that movie because it's enormously wonderful to have a movie made about your grandfather, especially one made with so much attention to detail and care, and where your grandfather is sort of equal parts William Shakespeare, Bugs Bunny, and Oscar Schindler. I mean, it's very hard to complain about that without seeming sort of churlish. So if someone comes to me and says, "God, didn't you just love it?" I'd be like, "Yeah, yeah, it was great. I mean, it's unbelievable." But if someone comes to me and says, "Didn't you think it was a little stiff and like sort of over determined and isn't there something sort of anti-improvisational about Fincher's whole method that seems kind of wrong for that style of the Hollywood in the 30s and 40s? And isn't there something frankly non-Jewish about the movie that's almost odd? And isn't it sort of dramatically inert that they just stay out there in Victorville once he's finished with the script rather than coming back to Los Angeles as he undoubtedly did? I would say, yeah, no, I sort of get that too. But I honestly, I'm so thrilled that it was made, that and made with such skill and attention to detail. I mean, it was amazing.
It's funny. There's always this pushback of Hollywood history isn't preserved. People are always fighting to get films preserved and history preserved and interviews, etc. And it's nice to see in situations like this, like there was so much detail because, when you pitch movie ideas to Hollywood these days, both in television and film, they say, no period, no period. We don't want any
Right,
period.
right,
It's like a
right.
standard thing. And of course, until George Clooney walks in and says, no, I want to do good night and good luck and say, oh, absolutely, George, no
Yeah.
problem.
Yes,
So
yes. Yeah, and if you have that kind of clout that Fincher obviously did have and does still have, you can get it made. But it's very, very hard to do that. So getting back to Citizen Kane, or even earlier, you mentioned the idiots thing. So one small detail from the movie Mank. Is Herman, when he first got out to Hollywood, he sent back a telegram to his friend Ben Hecht, and it said, will you accept $300 a week to come out and work for Paramount Pictures? There's millions to be grabbed out here, and your only competition is idiots. Don't let this get around. So Herman sends that telegram, and that's where I got the title for the book, Competing with Idiots, back, and it starts the flood of New York screenwriters. Well, in the movie, they have that telegram, but Herman has sent it to everybody, and that bothered Herman Mankiewicz aficionados like myself because Herman would never have repeated that joke. It's like, here's my one little dollop of genius. Talk amongst yourselves. Spread the myth of this telegram. I'm not sending it to anybody else. I sent it to you, Ben Hecht, and I know you're going to spread it around because I'm saying don't let this get around. So that kind of thing, whatever, it's an allowance for Hollywood. But that got me. Anyway, Herman was laid up in bed, had a car accident in New Mexico, and he'd kind of burnt all his bridges in Hollywood by when he met Welles, which was 1939. And he'd been fired from every studio, and one great story is, Dory Sherry fired him, and he said, I'm going to make sure not only you're not going to work for my studio, you're not going to work in any studio in town ever again. And Herman said, promises, promises. so so he's down on his luck. He's got no money, and Orson Welles has just come out to Hollywood to because he's been given a great contract from RKO where he can do whatever he wants. And he meets with Herman. They'd met before in New York City and just entertained the hell out of each other at a lunch at 21 Club, and left the lunch convinced that they were the two most brilliant men in the hemisphere, according to John Houseman. And he may have been right. They may have been right. So they start kicking around ideas. Herman writes a few radio scripts for Wells, and then says, I used to spend a lot of time with William Randolph Hearst. He'd be good as a sort of model for somebody, and because they have been also talking about a script where you're looking at somebody from a lot of different points of view. So when that idea landed, they were like, okay, that's it. That's what we're going to do. And so that was the inciting spark. And it's not totally clear who came up with the multi-narrator thing. Wells had done it before in something. Herman had sort of tried it in something before. It wasn't wholly original. But putting those two ideas together, that's what created Citizen Kane.
Got it. Got it. I have to ask you about a movie that was released 2 years before Citizen Kane, which you have a little tiny anecdote about. And I have to bring it up because I am such a Wizard of Oz fan. You said in the book that according to what you heard, that the idea of going from the opening black and white to full Technicolor when they land in Munchkinland may have been Herman's idea.
Yes, there are a few people who cite that, and so and in his notes he puts it in there. Now, I don't know for certainty that he hadn't inherited that idea from somebody else, but he was only on the picture for like 2 weeks or something, and he did like a 56-page outline, and he included all kinds of, there was another dog, and he had all kinds of ideas that didn't make it to the final script, but that did, going from black and white to color. And I always thought that was an interesting thing for Herman to have thought of, because he was such a gifted wordsmith, and that was really a cinematic idea. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. And by the time he worked on Wizard of Oz, his ambitions had been so thwarted that, I don't think he ever, and also he was lazy. So I don't think he ever really wanted to direct. But that makes me think, oh man, it would have been great if he directed one movie. If we had one thing where, if we believe in the auteur theory, where we could really say that's Herman Mankiewicz. And as it is, we have a lot of great scripts, but even his best script, obviously subject for much dispute over who wrote what in Citizen Kane and how much credit you get to give Herman and how much you should give Orson Welles.
He's under contract to MGM. He's working writer. He has a lot of credits and a lot of credits in IMDb where he's uncredited on screenplays. So he was really almost a utility infielder in the writing department, working on a lot of different shows. Let's move over for the time being, and we'll get back to Herman in a second. Let's talk a little bit about Joe. Now, Joe wasn't as nearly as damaged as Herman was. I mean, Herman was dealing with alcoholism. Joe is a different character altogether. Joe comes out to Hollywood and fits in easier. I mean, he's a very charismatic man. What do you think the main difference was between Joe's experience early on and Herman's?
Well, Herman never thought very much of Hollywood and never thought very much of himself for being successful in Hollywood. He thought the whole game was beneath him, and that he should be doing something else, whether that's writing plays or writing novels or doing political journalism. Who knows what he thinks he should have been doing? But it was something else. And by the time Joe gets there, which is just 2 or 3 years later, Joe got out there at the age of 19. The next wave of screenwriters took it very seriously and saw, wait a minute, this is a great business. This is an art form. This is, let's make great movies, And he played the game. He played the Hollywood game, both political game and also the studio game, and also the writing game, and then eventually the directing game. Like, I want to succeed at this thing. This thing isn't beneath me. I'm gonna take it seriously. And you describe he was charismatic. He was good looking and charming. Had a very easy charm. He wasn't anything like the charisma that Herman was. I mean, Herman was, you entered a party and it's like, oh my God, I got to get next to this guy because I don't know what he's going to say or do or throw up all over the tablecloth. Whatever it is, it's going to be great. Joe was, he was, I guess nowadays you would call him a little bit of a control freak. He was withheld. He was funny. He made his remarks and then, retreated behind the facade of the happy, smiley guy. It's a great picture of the two of them there. You can see that Herman is sort of troubled and weighed down by life a little bit, and Joe is just carefree man about town, gadabout.
Joe also seemed to be really interested in the dynamics of the female. There's
Mm.
something about getting inside their head and wanting to make movies about the human condition. He seemed to have a propensity towards female stories, and certainly, I guess one of his first triumphs was for Fox, A Letter to Three Wives. Uh,
Well, certainly as a director, yes, but even earlier, he was always injecting humanity usually into the scripts that he was producing. I mean, um, Louis B. Mayer said, you have to walk before you can crawl, or crawl before you can run. And so you've got to stay as a producer before you can direct. You can't just jump into the director's chair. So he worked his way up and did a lot of wonderful movies like Philadelphia Story that he produced, which is a fantastic female role in Katharine Hepburn. I mean, obviously it was adapted from the play, but Joe did a lot to sort of fix the script of that. And then, yes, once he does A Letter to Three Wives, he's really maturing as a writer and then director. And he was very, psychoanalysis was all the rage out in Hollywood at the time, and he, was very interested in the psychology of his characters and the psychology, in particular, of his female characters.
how important was Daryl Zanuck in his life at that point?
Zanuck, Zanuck, Zanuck. I think it very important, very, very important. Sorry, I had to let the dog out. I
That's
think Zanuck was, we mentioned A Letter to Three Wives. Joe wrote A Letter to Four Wives and gave it to Zanuck. And it was too long. And Zanuck said, yeah, the problem is you get too many wives. So cut that. Like, Zanuck was a great editor for Joe's scripts and a great producer of his films, and really made sure that Joe kind of stayed on the right path and didn't go off into long digressions, which Joe's scripts could be pretty talky, and Zanuck helped sort of curb that instinct in Joe, I think.
I found it interesting that one of the stars of Letter to Three Wives is Jean Crane, who you mentioned that Joe did not particularly care for Jean Crane, yet he cast Jean Crane. Or was that Zanuck shoving her down his throat?
No, I think he did cast her, but he didn't like her. And part of the reason he didn't like her is she had no neuroses. She seems to have been a very well-adjusted person, and therefore had no need for Joe, and certainly resisted. I'm not saying he tried to seduce her or anything, but his tricks didn't really work on her, and so he couldn't relate to her at all, and he couldn't help her. Joe was someone who really liked to help his actresses and actors too. I mean, but he really got in there with them, and if they were sort of non-neurotic, there was nothing for him to do other than stand there and then move over there when you say this line.
Well, what's interesting is his feeling towards her. He casts her again in People Will Talk. Now, I was
Yeah.
curious about that. Given what he knew about her, what was the particular motivation to bring her back in a movie that followed All About Eve?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of questions I wish I had been able to ask Joe. By the time I was working on the book, he was gone, and Geist never said, "Well, hold on, let me parse that about Jean Crane. Like, when was it that you realized you didn't like her? Was it after you cast her and People Will Talk, or was it before? I mean, it's possible that he sort of thought, nah, she was pretty good. I don't even remember, and then gives her the female lead and People Will Talk, and thinks, wait a minute, what was I doing? What was I thinking? I actually, yeah, it was Linda Darnell was the one I really loved working with on that. And I really got into her character, and Jean Crane, she carried her part fine. I don't know. So it's an interesting question for sure.
Well, Joe, of course, will forever be known as the director of All About Eve. All About Eve is a feast for anybody who loves the theater and show business and the characters. I find it to be kind of a tutorial on the issues that people have with each other in Hollywood. It's a very what's the key word here? It's a very cynical, acerbic look at a time, by the way, where Billy Wilder was across town making Sunset Boulevard,
It's
probably
crazy.
the most cynical movie in the history of Hollywood. But obviously a movie that put him, well, he had already won two Oscars for writing and directing A Letter to Three Wives. He follows that up with All About Eve, a tour de force for him and a movie that really made his career.
Yeah, I mean, it would make anybody's career. It was an incredibly great movie. As good as Letter to Three Wives may be, it's not All About Eve. All About Eve is really a masterwork on the level of Sunset Boulevard, I think. And what's interesting, that both those movies were made in the same year. All About Eve is sort of a love letter to theater, which Joe didn't really know that much about. I mean, he had this idea of theater. So it's like presented as like, oh, the theater, the theater. But in fact, what does the director do? He goes out to Hollywood and becomes a film director. And so it's cynical about Hollywood as well as Sunset Boulevard obviously is. But it holds up the theater as this sort of pure thing that is somehow above the crassness of. I mean, of course it's not. I mean, and what Eve does, in the course of the movie, you realize no, it's all the same. It's show business, and it's very cynical about show business.
Well, I guess was Otto Preminger was the one who cast Clifton Webb as Lydecker in Laura, and of course George Sanders is the character in Addison DeWitt. Is that
Addison DeWitt, yes.
Addison DeWitt, who is kind of like the central kind of narrating voice of the movie? And but one little anecdote you mentioned in your book, which I find fascinating, because I've always been a huge fan of everything that Thelma Ritter has done. And
Hmm.
it's nice to hear what Joe said about Thelma Ritter. She has a very tiny part in All About Eve, but we know her from such films as Rear Window. I mean, she's Stella, Rear Window. But it was fun to hear that he was a big fan of hers.
Oh, a huge fan of hers. Yeah, I can't remember, but I think he called her a Stradivarius. I mean,
He did. He
yeah,
did.
that she was just an incredible instrument. And yeah, she plays Birdie, the sort of dresser of Margot Channing and Betty Davis, who's on to Eve Harrington from the start.
At a time when character actors were like the lifeblood of Hollywood. And it's funny today, the business is 9,000% different than it was back in the 40s and 50s. But the concept of a character actor today is very different. We have them, but not 25 of them under contract to every studio like they had back in the 50s or in the 40s. Well, let's go back to Herman just for a second, because Herman did not just write Citizen Kane. He actually wrote a very favorable sports movie called The Pride of the Yankees, which was all about Lou Gehrig. And I didn't even know that. I didn't realize that was his film as well. Was Herman a big baseball fan?
He was a big baseball fan, and when I was growing up, it was yeah. He wrote Pride of the Yankees and also Citizen Kane. I mean, Pride of the Yankees was important when I was a kid because it was like, oh my God, it's a baseball movie and it's so great, and Lou Gehrig dies and it's so sad, and it's like the greatest movie of all time. And then I realized, oh, okay, it's good, but it's not Citizen Kane. Yeah, no, Herman was a big baseball fan.
Probably, and I'm not sure about this because there was so much pressure against Citizen Kane when it opened because didn't they have a problem getting theaters because of the pressure that Hearst was putting on them?
Yes, Hearst had made it very difficult, and there was a very big campaign. The Hearst newspapers gathering together, you know, denouncing the movie. Some cases even before they'd seen it, giving it bad reviews. But RKO, to its credit, you know, insisted on you know, putting the movie out. I think they'd even offered not Wells, Kane, Hearst had offered RKO $1 million just to burn it, you know, and they didn't. They put it out, and yeah. But it was very. It was a difficult, you know, release, and but it did, you know, it was a big boost, obviously, for Herman's career. But it didn't really take. It didn't last that long. I mean, then he was sort of back in favor, and he again cycled through the various studios, getting fired again from all of them. But early on in that sort of second wave, he did do Pride of the Yankees.
Is it safe to say that Pride of the Yankees was a bigger hit than Citizen Kane?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it certainly exceeded expectations more than Citizen Kane did, but Citizen Kane was nominated for something like 10
Sure.
Academy Awards and won only one, whereas, of course, Mank won two.
The I think that the primary competition that year for the Oscars was the John Ford film How Green Was My Valley, and I think there was
Right.
probably a lot of inside maneuvering to get away. I guess Orson Welles was not exactly the favorite son of Hollywood at
No,
the time.
nobody liked Orson Welles. I mean, he
No.
was so, you know, arrogant and full of himself and coming out there and acting like he, you know, was the biggest train set a boy could have, you know. And it was like, well, yeah, it is. I mean, when you really think about it, it's like, oh, what a terrific thing to say, and he's right. But he rubbed people the wrong way, and nobody wanted to see him succeed, really.
Well, another one of Herman's pictures is another baseball movie, and I remember seeing this on television back in the 60s, which is The Pride of St. Louis. So another Pride movie,
Yep.
and with Dan Daly playing the irrepressible Dizzy Dean. Dizzy Dean.
Dizzy Dean, yeah. I
Dizzy
can't
Dean.
remember who plays Daffy Dean, but they're, you know, Dizzy had his brother Daffy.
Dizzy and
Yeah, the Pride of St. Louis, you know, it's a little bit, I mean, there are all kinds of parallels of sort of trying to catch lightning in a bottle that second time. And it didn't really work. You know, it's okay.
No, it didn't. It didn't. But it for a viewer, it was a fun movie because of Dan Daly and the character.
Right, right,
Um,
right.
so Joe makes All About Eve, wins a couple of Oscars. We talked a little bit about People Will Talk. Then he, as you point out, he's dealing in all different types of genres. He does a musical, which I thought was very out of character for him, and a very kind of a fun, just audience friendly musical, Guys and Dolls, casting Marlon Brando as Sky Masterson, of course, Frank Sinatra and Gene Simmons, and remind me who the blonde is. That's
Vivian Blaine.
Vivian Blaine. Thank you. Thank you. Just a fun movie and very different for him to direct, as I recall from your writing.
Yeah, it was very theatrical. It's not like he opened it up and made you feel like you were at a movie, really. It was just a very well filmed stage adaptation. But you know, it's a great show and totally fun. The songs are great. You know, Brando is weird. You know, you don't ordinarily think of Brando as a song and dance man, and you won't after seeing this movie. But Sinatra's great, and you know, it's definitely fun. It's you know, it's a bit of a misfire. It doesn't really belong in the rest of Joe's sort of canon. But on the other hand, that's one of the great things about Joe is he was willing to try it. And at that point in his life, you know, he was running his own shop. He had his own production company, and he was really choosing what to do. He was no longer kind of on the studio's at their beck and call. He could do what he wanted. And so it was interesting that, I found it interesting that in the 50s, after the huge success of All About Eve, and he's at the top of his game, he wins 4 Oscars in 2 years, nobody ever done it before. Um, he he moved to New York and just did all kinds of different things. And every movie was different from every other movie. When you might think, hey, you hit this vein of social satire with All About Eve. How about keep doing that for us? Because that we like that. But he didn't do that. And so he made all kinds of different movies, and some are more successful than others.
He had previously worked with Marlon Brando on the Julius Caesar movie in
Yeah, that's another one. Yeah.
yeah, very much bringing Shakespeare to Hollywood, and that was something. But of course, towards the end of his career, or perhaps the movie that spelled the end of his career, of course, is Cleopatra, and you present a very, very fascinating story of the attraction of doing this. I think he mentions at one point that it helped him buy a house, and there were all sorts
Yeah,
of
I mean,
financial.
the attraction is the word money. But the thing about Joe is he would do it for the money, but then once he gets into it, he wants to make it great. And so it really did break him. He spent 2 unbelievably arduous years. The train had left the station by the time he was hired. They had Ruben Mamoulian, who left the movie because it was just ridiculous. There were already so many cost overruns, and they had Elizabeth Taylor as Cleopatra, but they ended up having to recast the two male leads and start all over again. And Joe never had time to finish his script. I mean, that's the real problem there. Is he wanted to do this sort of what he called intimate epic, where he would, Shakespeare-like or Shaw-like, tell the story of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, and he just, he was writing at night and filming during the day and getting vitamin B shots in his hip every night, and just to keep him going. And it very nearly killed him, and it did, it sort of marked the end of his career as a number one Hollywood director, because the movie essentially broke Fox, or nearly broke Fox, and he was widely blamed, which he really should not have been, for the disaster. Terrific. I mean, for those of you who may want to know more, the TCM did a great podcast on it. The Plot Thickens this year, just devoted to the making of Cleopatra, that really goes into the ins and outs of it. And it is an incredible story. Somebody should turn it into a limited series.
Of course, they should. Great character ideas. I remember working on Ghostbusters, and the production designer was John DeKeer, and John
Oh,
DeKeer was the designer of Cleopatra, and he went into quite a lot of detail about how he had to build Rome 3 different times. First, they decided to shoot in England, which has the worst weather.
the worst idea. I mean, it's so obviously a terrible idea. It's just hard to imagine that anybody signed off on that.
Terrible idea. Then they moved down to Rome. Elizabeth Taylor gets sick. Interestingly, as a young boy growing up in West Los Angeles, I used to ride my bike past the Fox studios in the early 60s. And for a number of years, a lot of the statuary from Cleopatra dotted the whole parking lots and bridges. You couldn't go 20 feet without bumping over a giant statue. And of course, they had I think the entrance into Rome by Elizabeth, Cleopatra was
Yeah,
shot on that Fox lot after
yeah.
all the craziness of it. One more discussion here. Cleopatra didn't quite finish his career. He does come back, and he does a marvelous film with Laurence Olivier and Michael Caine called Sleuth. And unlike a lot of directors who go out on a thump, not a good one, he went out on a good movie.
Yeah, yeah, he did. Sleuth is pretty good, and he'd had a string after Cleopatra. He did a few other films. He did the Western, and he did that weird adaptation. I can't remember the Honey Pot. You feel in watching these movies like, oh, he's lost it. But in Sleuth, totally height of his powers. He's got Laurence Olivier, Michael Caine, a two-hander, and he joked he was the only director in history to have his entire cast nominated for Academy Awards, and he really goes out on a high. And after that, he did, I mean, he worked a lot trying to come up with other things. He was offered All the President's Men, but sort of never quite could figure it out, and so ended up he didn't do it. But eventually, one day, he did say to his son, I think Sleuth is a good one to have gone out on. Like, it's okay if I never make another movie, because that sort of wrapped it up nicely.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Speaking of his sons, I actually got to know Tom very well because I wrote a number of books on the James Bond movies, and
Oh,
one of my favorite interviews is with Tom Mankiewicz, and then and he had such great insight into both Sean and Roger Moore because he had worked with both of them.
right.
He told me some great stories. And then in 1996, I believe, or no, 1992, I went up to Toronto and I worked on a film directed by Tom.
Oh, was it Dragnet?
No, it was a television movie for Showtime called Taking the Heat
Oh,
with
okay.
George Siegel and Tony Goldwyn. So I
Oh,
spent
neat.
time with Tom. Really, really terrific guy. Very
Yeah.
terrific guy. Well, everybody, the title of the book is Competing with Idiots. It's available on Amazon. Run, do not walk to get this book. Because if you love film history and you want to learn a little bit about I shouldn't say learn a little bit, you want to learn a lot about these two twin legends of writing and in Joe's case, directing, you should pick up this book. I've already influenced two people to buy it. So we're
That is great. I love hearing that. And I do, first of all, Steve, thank you so much. It's been a great conversation. I've had a few friends of mine who have said, I just don't know. It looks so long, and it's not that long. But what I've said to them is then get the audiobook and listen to it on 1.4 speed. I mean, and I was lucky enough to get to record the audiobook as a retired ham. And yeah, so it's a I'm so happy this book is out there in the world after having spent 19 years on it.
yeah.
I'm thrilled to talk about it. So thank you.
Absolutely. When you record a book, do you read every word?
Yes, and I had a director in my ear who was very insistent on my reading every word and not changing it, even though, there were some sentences where I was like, God, this sentence is really long and complicated. Why
So
can't I break this up?
here's a question. Do you also read the footnotes as well?
Yes, I did. I did.
Wow.
I took my cue from Keith Hernandez, who read his book, and I listened to his, and he would go footnote, and then and then read the footnote, and so I would do footnote,
And
and the
by the
other
way,
fun, yeah,
I
it
was just
was
going to say to
really.
the listeners and viewers that the footnotes are equally fascinating. What were you about to say?
Well, just that the other thing that I realized as soon as I hadn't thought about it until I started, but there's a lot of quotes from people like Michael Caine, and so you're like, oh, should I do a Michael Caine imitation? I mean, those kinds of things go through your head, and when you're not an actor, you really are. And luckily, I had this director in my ear who was, I would do a little bit of a Michael Caine, and he would say, less, less. you know.
Well, everyone, you have been listening to the latest edition of Saturday Night at the Movies. Our guest has been Nick Davis. Again, the book's title is Competing with Idiots. If you like the show, please give us a thumbs up. Write a comment if you like. We always like hearing from comments. And please listen to our other podcast, Tales from Hollywoodland, which I co-host with Julian Schlossberg and Arthur E. Friedman. That's also available on the internet. You can pop it on. This show itself is available on YouTube. If you're not watching it, you're listening. You can watch it on YouTube. And I mentioned the True TV Plus Fast channel. Nick, thank you so much. Oh,
Thank you.
before we go, tell us something we can talk about that you've done recently that we can go see that you would like to tout.
Well, I've just had a film premiere at the Toronto Film Festival, a documentary about depending on your point of view, either the little known or legendary 1972 Toronto production of the musical Godspell. which starred a totally unknown cast who turned out to be Martin Short and Gilda Radner and Eugene Levy and Andrea Martin, and Paul Schaefer was the musical conductor, and Victor Garber played Jesus, and Dave Thomas came in midway through the run. And it was sort of this, before Saturday Night Live, before Second City or SCTV or any of this, this was kind of the inciting incident of the comedy revolution of the last 50 years or so. And the documentary is called You Had to Be There. And we just showed it at Toronto, and it went really well. And now we're seeking distribution, but I'm hopeful and confident that people will be able to see it at some point in the near future.
Terrific. Well, we'll be there for You Had to Be There. That sounds great. Any books on the horizon?
Yeah. Talk to me in another 19 years.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Nick. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.